Memorial gates. They're the pillars to the gates, which were inaugurated by the Queen, I think, back in 2002. And they're in memory of the 5 million, mostly men, from different parts of the British Empire, as it then was, who fought alongside Britain in the First and Second World Wars. And they stand there as a permanent reminder of the immense sacrifice and contribution of people from all parts of the Commonwealth now, but Empire as it was, to those two big conflicts in the 20th century. The flames burn constantly, and as you drive past late at night, they cast a really big glow where the traffic is thundering by on Hyde Park Corner. But we'll see those gates again in a short while when the procession makes its way. We can hear Big Ben, which is suddenly tolling. Now, there's a reason for that. That is because Big Ben, which has been out of action for lots of the time over the past few years, is working again today. And that is because there will be 1 minute tolling of Big Ben for every year of the Queen's long life, 96. So well over an hour and a half of tolling of the bell at Big Ben. So if you hear the bell tolling, it's because of that. And of course, that'll be a bit of a powerful backdrop to lots of the events that will happen in Parliament Square in the next hour or so, as the first procession forms up, ready for the transfer of the coffin over to Westminster Abbey. So we're getting closer to the time now where we'll see parts of the ceremony taking place. With me, the historian and broadcaster David Olusoga, and the journalist and author, certainly respected commentator, writer for the Daily Mail, Robert Hardman. Good to have you both with us. And I'm thinking, David, really, when we see those Commonwealth gates, which have been there now for 20 years, I sometimes feel that they're not given the prominence that they probably deserve when you look at the kind of royal landmarks and other landmarks, military landmarks in London. But it's good for us to be highlighting what is actually quite a big aspect of the way people assess the Queen's reign, how she managed the change from this world of empire to a commonwealth of equal nations as it's set out. What's your assessment of the way that that happened?
Well, I think if you read books about the history of the Commonwealth, what you find is both historians but also Commonwealth leaders, they almost always end up with the same metaphor. They describe the Queen as glue, the glue that holds this thing together. Because if you think about the Commonwealth, its commonalities are not obvious. Not all of the nations in the Commonwealth were former British colonies, and even those that were, they have very different histories. Ireland's in the Caribbean under English, then British rule from the 1600s, African nations under the British Empire for less than a century. There's no commonality of language. There's hundreds of languages spoken in the Commonwealth. What they've had in common is this figure for 70 years. And that metaphor of glue, it is the one everyone ends up with.
Constancy, that's what we're talking about, Robert. And that applies to the Commonwealth just as much as it does to public life here in Britain.
It certainly does, Hugh. And I often think with the Commonwealth, and we saw those wonderful scenes just now on that video, and I think there's a perception that perhaps, the Queen had a lovely time travelling around the Commonwealth and visiting all these lovely places, and that it was all very serene and elegant. And what I think that overlooks is the fact she wasn't just a symbol. She was a player. She was absolutely crucial, particularly in those early days of the Commonwealth, when it was coming into what we call the modern Commonwealth, when it wasn't just the old white dominions, when African nations were starting to assert, get their identity, get independence. And she was absolutely crucial in helping the organisation establish its identity, giving it a royal palace just down the road from here, Marlborough House, giving it an annual service in the church over there, Westminster Abbey. It needed focal points. It needed a sort of stature and recognition. And she was very important in that. And there were often times when the Commonwealth was very split on all sorts of things. And you speak to former Secretary Generals like Sonny Ramphal, Emeka Anyukwu, they will tell you that if it wasn't for the Queen, the Commonwealth would no longer exist.
How do you assess Her Majesty's stewardship? I mean, how politically savvy was she in the way that she managed this process?
Well, it's a strange phrase to use for someone who occupied a hereditary position. But when it comes to the Commonwealth, the Queen was a professional. She was, in a way, a career woman. This was something that she dedicated enormous amounts of energy, time and intellect to. And another thing that you'll come across if you talk to people who really understand the Commonwealth is that nobody, literally nobody, understood it as well as the late Queen.
I mean, that understanding, as you say, Robert, really is at the heart of the way that she knew how to adjust, how to tack now and again, and how really to deal with individuals, leaders who were themselves under huge pressure, and to understand the pressures that they were under and unable maybe to deliver some of the compromises that were needed. It needed a lot of political sensitivity in that way. And
it needed a human touch. And I think it was very important that she was sort of the same age as a lot of these founding fathers of these Commonwealth nations. You know, they very much felt she was a contemporary, an ally. They might have their run-ins with the British government. They had many, and for very good reasons. I mean, many of them had actually been in prison at the hands of the British government in the days when they were fighting for independence. They could see that in the Queen they had this completely different figure who wouldn't get involved in policy, but who would respect them as an equal, and very firm friendships were forged. And whenever they gathered, she was a friend.
Can we pause for a second? Because what we're going to do is continue the conversation, but just to explain to viewers at home, now that we're approaching the point where we'll see some of the processions forming up, as we say, we want to just obviously keep tabs on all of that, and that's happening in different centres. More than 3,000 participants will be taking part in the main procession. Fewer in the first procession, but trust me, no less impressive for that, because when those pipes and drums start to play and they make their way from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey, that's the first procession we'll see. It's the smaller of the two. It will be hugely impressive and hugely moving. So as we look ahead to those preparations, let's join JJ once again.
Well, as you were saying, Hugh, the Commonwealth was of great importance to Her Majesty the Queen. And for those that serve within the various services within the Commonwealth, the Queen was of great importance to them. I'm joined by some Commonwealth service personnel that have travelled from across the Commonwealth to be here today. We'll start with yourself, Gunnar Regan, Powell. You've travelled from New Zealand. When did you get here, and how long did it take you to get here?
Yeah, we left home on Friday. Took us a big long 29 hours to get here. Yeah, definitely took a while adjusting with the jet lag and all that, but we're here, it's the main thing.
And you've been very busy since landing?
Yep. Yeah, a whole lot of walking around, keeping the arms straight.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
And an opportunity as well to meet the Prince of Wales, the new Prince of Wales. What did he say to you?
Well, one thing he did say to me was that he was quite, he said it to me really firmly, that the Queen, she looked down on the smallest, most minute things. And he asked me how my drill was. Told him it was a bit rusty, but I'll make sure it's good now.
Well, I'm sure you've had an opportunity to polish it up this week. Sergeant Major Scott Williamson and Derby here. Scott, sorry, microphone. Well, you are one of the civilian services that will be on parade today. I mean, first of all, Derby here. You haven't brought him along with you, have you?
No, we haven't. In fact, he used to live with us in Ottawa in Canada, but he is one of 8 horses that we've gifted to Her Majesty since 1969, 4 of which are still alive today, living a great life at the Windsor Castle at the Royal Mews, and 4 of them are going to be on parade today, ridden by members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
You had a personal connection to Her Majesty the Queen, is that right, sir?
I did. You know, as members of the force, we have a great connection and a great relationship with Her Majesty. So for all members of the force, we're certainly grieving the loss of Her Majesty. But I think for me, I've had an opportunity to have 2 personal audiences with Her Majesty, which also makes this just that much more personal.
Wow. Well, go well, all 3 of you, I should say, and thank you very much for travelling all this way and being a part of this historic day.
Thank you, it's our pleasure.
So the scene just a few metres away from where JJ was talking to the Mounties there, and Let's take a look at this, because we have more than 140 naval ratings. They are young members of the Royal Navy. Some of them have been serving for literally just a few months. And my word, they have an enormous duty today, because they are there to draw the big, heavy gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin with the crown and the orb and sceptre. And they'll draw that coffin from Westminster Hall over to Westminster Abbey, and then after the service, accompanied there by the band of His Majesty's Royal Marines, they'll be making their way to Wellington Arch eventually after the service. Notice I said His Majesty's Royal Marines. It does take a lot of focusing, because we're so used to saying the band of Her Majesty's Royal Marines, but now His Majesty's. And the naval ratings here now just entering Whitehall, and they will next be seen down in Palace Yard at the Palace of Westminster, ready for the coffin to emerge and ready for that gun carriage to be drawn across Parliament Square. At Westminster Abbey, they are mostly now in place, congregation of around 2,000 people. So let's join Fergal once again.
The general congregation is indeed now fully seated, and we await the arrival of heads of state and overseas government representatives. They'll join over 2,000 people who've been invited today. Some of them are specially invited members of Her Majesty's patronages and representatives from the emergency services and public servants. Almost 200 key workers and volunteers named in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in June have been invited to attend. Many of these people recognised for their extraordinary contributions and responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Queen awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest award for civilian gallantry, to the entire NHS in the wake of the pandemic. And it reminds us that the Queen's own life was one of constant service, from the great occasions of state and foreign visits, to the smaller but no less essential journeys she made across the United Kingdom throughout her reign, week after week, year after year. And there the tomb, the stone to the unknown soldier, where the Queen laid lilies on the 100th anniversary of the armistice in 2018, and she stood there with the German President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He will also be in attendance today. During her reign, Queen Elizabeth supported over 600 organisations. Over 400 of these were inherited from her father, King George VI, reflecting the continuity of royal service. That tradition continued in recent years when she began distributing some of her patronages to other members of the royal family. Even into her old age, dedication to public and voluntary service was unwavering. And as we watch the arrival of overseas heads of state and political leaders, we're reminded that the Queen was also the most travelled monarch in history. During her reign, she travelled over 1 million miles to over 115 countries before she completed her last tour, a trip to Malta with Prince Philip in 2015, an island where they'd lived as a young married couple. Her first overseas trip as monarch was when she arrived in Kenya on the 1st of February 1952 as Princess Elizabeth. 6 days later, she flew home as Queen after the death of her father. Kenya's new President William Ruto is attending, his first international trip as president. Not only was the Queen well-travelled, she also welcomed many heads of state and important global figures to her home. During her reign, she received over 100 official state visits. And now representatives of foreign government, of the Commonwealth, filing towards their seats. And now we see representatives of foreign governments, the Prime Minister of Egypt among the group of people now filing through the doors. What is so striking is this respectful silence. And all of this, all that we watch now, reminds us that throughout the decades of an ever-changing world and ever-changing politics, the Queen was the true constant. We hear now the music of the organ being played by the suborganist of Westminster Abbey, Paul Holder. A figure of unity in her time, but also sending a message into the future to all of the leaders of foreign countries and all those from the Commonwealth, of the need, the essential gesture of reconciliation which she embodied.
The scene at Wellington Barracks, where the elements of the procession are now forming up, including the naval ratings, who are ready to draw the gun carriage, and they will be in a short while. And of course, we've seen as well the pipes and drums. 200 members of the massed pipes and drums will be leaving Wellington Barracks for that short journey to Palace Yard, Westminster. They'll be playing some tunes along the way, traditional ones, often favourites of Her Majesty. All of this music and all the elements of the day's events, of course, have been formally approved over many years. And lots of the tunes would have been played for the Queen and guests at Windsor and at Holyrood House and Balmoral. Often you'd see the pipers there entertaining after dinner. So they're just getting ready to step off. And the drum majors, very smart in their traditional uniforms. So they're standing by to make their way up to Parliament Square itself. And they will be leading the procession from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey. It's a procession that will also include members of the royal family led by the King, and then more than 140 of the naval ratings will be drawing the carriage. Very strong representation of the Scottish and Irish regiments in the mass pipes and drums, but not exclusively, of course. But they look magnificent and smart, don't they, all of them? And the sound they make will be intense and powerful. The Queen, of course, was a great lover of the bagpipes, as indeed was the Queen Mother for her, and one of the great features of the Queen Mother's funeral back in 2002, 20 years ago, was the massed pipes and drums. And just in the background there, you can see the Tri-Service Guard of Honour, made up of the Army, Navy and Air Force. They are making their way in, ready to be providing a Guard of Honour in Parliament Square, facing the gates to Palace Yard, again, ready for that first procession to take place. So the great area here of Wellington Barracks and the parade ground, where you'll also see lots of drill taking place during the year. This is where they're setting off. So the pipes and drums ready to join Birdcage Walk and travelling up to the right-hand side and making their way smartly up to Parliament Square. Followed by the ratings, and a real sense now that the